The medical supplies in Cargo Bay 3 had shifted again. Nira Wells could hear them sliding every time she made a course adjustment. She made a mental note to fix the straps at the next stop. Those supplies were heading to a frontier colony where children were waiting for vaccines, and a young girl named Bess needed medication for her failing lungs. The cargo was more important than Nira's comfort. She was 34 years old and had spent the last 6 years hauling cargo along routes that bigger ships refused to fly. Before that, she had worked emergency rescue on a mining colony, pulling workers out of collapsed tunnels and treating burns from equipment failures. That job had taught her two things. First, panic killed faster than any injury. Second, there was always something you could do, even when it seemed like there was nothing. Her ship was called the Drifter. It was old, patched in a dozen places, and made sounds that no ship should make. But it flew. Nira knew every bolt and wire in its frame. She talked to it sometimes when the silence of space became too heavy. She was checking her navigation charts when the scanner beeped. Something large had appeared nearby. Too large and too sudden to be natural. Before she could adjust course, the Drifter shuddered violently. The controls went dead in her hands. Through the front viewport, she watched a massive ship swallow her whole, pulling her into a docking bay that could have held 50 vessels her size. Nira did not scream. She took 3 deep breaths and began counting exits. The bay was cold and gray, lit by lights that hurt her eyes. Automated clamps locked the Drifter in place. Nira grabbed her tool belt out of habit, strapping it around her waist before the airlock was forced open from outside. 2 figures stood waiting for her. They were tall and thin, with pale blue skin and 4 arms each. Their faces were smooth, with small mouths and large dark eyes that did not blink. They wore simple white garments that looked like lab coats. One was taller than the other, his posture straight with the confidence of someone who had never been questioned. The smaller one stood slightly behind, watching Nira with what might have been curiosity. The tall one spoke. His voice came through a device on his chest that translated his words into flat, emotionless English. "You are the human. You will come with us." Nira stepped out of her ship slowly. She looked around the bay, noting the doors, the control panels, the height of the ceiling. Her heart was beating fast, but her hands were steady. "Who are you?" "I am Orvin. This is Pell. We are researchers. Your species is of academic interest to us." He said it the way someone might describe a new type of insect. "You have been selected for study." "Study," Nira repeated. "You will be placed in an observation chamber. Your cooperation is not required." Nira looked at the 2 aliens for a long moment. Then she asked, "What happens to my cargo?" Orvin tilted his head slightly. The question seemed to confuse him. "Your cargo is irrelevant." "It is not irrelevant," Nira said. Her voice was calm but firm. "Those are medical supplies. There's a colony waiting for them. Children who need vaccines. A girl who cannot breathe properly without her medication. If the cargo does not arrive, people will suffer." Pell shifted behind Orvin, her dark eyes fixed on Nira with sudden intensity. Orvin waved one of his 4 hands dismissively. "The concerns of your colony are not our concern. You will come now." Nira did not resist as they led her through gray corridors into the depths of their ship. She walked with her back straight, her eyes always moving, always counting, always remembering. The walls were smooth and cold. The air smelled wrong, like chemicals and something older, something that had never known sunlight. They brought her to a room with transparent walls. Inside was a simple bed, a small table, and scattered equipment that looked broken or abandoned. The door sealed behind her with a soft hiss. Orvin's voice came through a speaker in the ceiling. "You will remain here. We will begin our observations soon." Nira said nothing. She stood in the center of the room and looked at her new prison. Then she began to examine every corner, every crack, every piece of forgotten equipment. Her hands moved automatically, sorting, testing, remembering. Behind the viewing screen, Pell watched the human work. She had seen hundreds of species captured for study. Most cried. Some screamed. Some simply sat and waited to die. This one was different. "Why is she doing that?" Pell asked quietly. Orvin barely glanced at the screen. Primitive coping behavior. Keeping busy to avoid confronting her fear. It means nothing. Pell watched Nira pick up a cracked pipe and examine it closely, running her fingers along its length like she was reading something written there. Are you certain? I have studied thousands of species for 2 centuries, Orvin said. Humans are fragile, oxygen-dependent creatures from a dangerous planet. They have clever hands and simple brains. She will behave as all the others have behaved when the experiment begins. Pell said nothing more, but she kept watching, and somewhere deep in her mind, a small voice whispered that Orvin might be wrong. 3 hours had passed since they locked her in the chamber. Nira had not wasted a single minute. The room was maybe 20 feet across, with transparent walls on all sides that let her captors watch everything she did. The furniture was basic. A metal bed frame with a thin cushion. A small table bolted to the floor. Scattered around the edges were pieces of equipment from previous experiments, abandoned and forgotten. To most people, it would have looked like garbage. To Nira, it looked like a supply closet. She had already made a mental list of everything useful. There was a cracked pipe running along the base of one wall, leading somewhere deeper into the ship. A broken display screen that still had wiring inside. Strips of fabric from what might have been another bed covering. A container of thick gel that smelled like industrial sealant. Some kind of powder coating on certain wall panels that came off when she scratched it. Her years in emergency rescue had trained her to see possibilities where others saw only problems. Every collapsed tunnel had air pockets. Every fire had escape routes. Every disaster had survivors who needed someone calm enough to find them. She tested the transparent walls. Solid. Probably some kind of reinforced material that would not break no matter how hard she hit it. She checked the seals around the door. Tight. No gaps. She examined the small vents near the ceiling. Too small to crawl through, but they connected to some kind of air circulation system. She was tracing the path of the cracked pipe when Orvin's voice came through the ceiling speaker. Human, we will now begin our experiment. You have been selected to help us understand how your species responds to environmental stress. Nira stood up slowly. What kind of stress? You will see. Behind the viewing screen, Orvin turned to Pell with something like excitement in his flat expression. Watch carefully. This is always the most interesting moment. The moment they realize what is happening. Pell leaned forward, her 4 hands clasped together. Her sensors were tracking the human's vital signs. Heart rate elevated but steady. Breathing normal. No signs of the panic response they usually saw at this stage. Orvin pressed a control on his panel. Inside the chamber, Nira heard it immediately. A soft hissing sound coming from the vents. Not air coming in, air going out. The pressure in the room began to drop. Her ears popped once, then again. The atmosphere was being sucked away. She had maybe 6 minutes before the oxygen levels dropped too low for her brain to function. Maybe 8 if she stayed calm and controlled her breathing. After that, unconsciousness. After that, death. She did not scream. She did not pound on the walls. She did not beg. She closed her eyes for 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, she let the fear wash through her completely. She acknowledged it. She accepted it. Then she put it aside and opened her eyes. Time to work. She moved to the crack pipe first. It ran along the wall and disappeared into the floor, which meant it connected to something below. Life support, probably, or some kind of atmospheric system. If she could tap into it, she might find breathable air. The crack was small, but it was there. She could feel the faintest trace of pressure from inside the pipe. Something was flowing through it. She grabbed the broken display screen and began pulling it apart with practiced hands. The wiring inside was flexible. Good. She could use that. The screen itself had a rubber seal around the edges that she peeled away carefully. The air was getting thinner. She could feel it now, each breath giving her less than the one before. Her movement stayed steady, but she worked faster. Orvin watched with his dark eyes wide. What is she doing? Pell checked her instruments. Her oxygen saturation is dropping. She should be panicking by now. She should be, Orvin agreed. But the human was not panicking. She was building something. Nira used a sharp piece of metal from the screen to widen the crack in the pipe. Not too much, just enough. She needed to tap the flow, not break it completely. The gel sealant went around the edges, creating a crude but airtight connection. The flexible tubing from the wiring became a delivery system. Her hands were starting to shake from oxygen deprivation. Her vision was getting fuzzy at the edges. She had maybe 2 minutes left. She wrapped fabric around the end of the tubing, creating a filter and a seal that would fit against her face. It was ugly. It was rough. It would not win any engineering awards, but it might keep her alive. She pressed the device to her mouth and nose and took a breath. The air that came through tasted like metal and chemicals. It was stale and thin, but it was air. Oxygen flowed into her lungs, and her vision cleared. The shaking in her hands slowed. She sat back against the wall, holding the crude breather to her face, and looked directly at the viewing screen. At Orvin. At Pell. Her eyes were steady. She was not dead. She was not dying. She had found a way. Orvin stared at his instruments in disbelief. The chamber was at near vacuum. No species in 2 centuries of research had ever done what this human just did. Not in 6 minutes. Not with garbage and scraps. Impossible, he whispered. Pell said nothing. She just watched the human breathe, slow and steady, through a device that should not exist. Pell had been watching the human for 2 hours now. In all that time, Nira Wells had not moved from her position against the wall. She sat with her back straight, the crude, breathing device pressed to her face, her eyes open and alert. Every few minutes, she would check the seal where her contraption connected to the cracked pipe. Every few minutes, she would adjust the fabric filter. But she did not panic. She did not cry. She simply existed, breathing in a room that should have killed her. Orvin stood at the main control panel, running calculations over and over. The numbers did not make sense to him. The chamber was still at near vacuum. The atmospheric pressure was so low that any oxygen-dependent creature should have lost consciousness within minutes. Yet there sat the human, calm as if she were waiting for a transport shuttle. The pipe, Orvin muttered. She somehow knew that pipe connected to our secondary life support system. How could she know that? Pell asked. She could not. It was a guess. A lucky guess. Pell looked at the human again, at the way her eyes moved constantly, tracking details, remembering patterns. Was it luck? Or did she figure it out? Orvin did not answer. Instead, he reached for the controls again. Let us see how adaptable she truly is. Inside the chamber, Nira noticed a change in the air coming through her breather. The metallic taste grew stronger, sharper. There was something new in the flow, something that made her throat tighten and her eyes water. They were adding poison to her air supply. She did not hesitate. She pulled the breather away from her face and spat out the contaminated breath. Her lungs burned, but she had learned long ago that the first instinct to gasp was the enemy. She held what little clean air remained in her chest and examined her device. The fabric filter was simple, meant only to catch particles, not chemical agents. She needed something better, something that could absorb or neutralize whatever they were pumping through the pipe. Her eyes went to the wall panel where she had noticed the strange powder coating earlier. She had scraped some off during her initial survey of the room. It had felt chalky, almost like calcium or some kind of mineral compound. Minerals could sometimes absorb toxins. It was worth a try. Moving quickly, she scraped more powder from the wall in her palm. She pulled apart her filter, added the powder between layers of fabric, and sealed it back together with more of the gel sealant. The whole process took maybe 90 seconds. Her vision was starting to go dark around the edges when she pressed the modified breather to her face and took a careful breath. The air still tasted wrong, but the sharp chemical edge was weaker. The powder was doing something. Not perfect, but enough. She breathed deeply and let her racing heart slow down. Behind the viewing screen, Orvin slammed one of his 4 hands against the console. That is not possible. She should not know how to do that. Her species has no training for this. Pell was taking notes with 2 hands while monitoring the sensors with her other 2. Her files say she worked emergency rescue on a mining colony. Perhaps she encountered chemical hazards there. This is different. This is improvisation at a level we have never documented. Maybe, Pell said quietly, humans are better at improvisation than we thought. Orvin's dark eyes narrowed. He was not angry exactly. He was something worse. He was fascinated. And when Orvin became fascinated by a subject, he pushed until he found its breaking point. He entered a new command into the system. Inside the chamber, the temperature began to drop. Nira felt it immediately, the cold seeping through the floor and walls, wrapping around her like a frozen blanket. Within minutes, her breath was misting in the air. Her fingers grew stiff. The shivering started deep in her chest and spread outward. She knew hypothermia. She had treated it many times. The body's core temperature dropping, the blood retreating from the extremities, the mind growing slow and confused. If she did not act, she would fall asleep and never wake up. The bed cushion. She had noted it earlier. Thin but insulated. She grabbed it and tore it apart, pulling out the filling material inside. It was some kind of synthetic fiber designed to hold warmth. She wrapped it around herself like a cocoon, leaving only her face exposed for the breather. IT was not enough. The cold was too deep. She needed heat. Her eyes went to the broken display screen she had already stripped for parts. There were still wires inside. Wires carried electricity. Electricity made heat. Carefully, with shaking hands, she pulled 2 wires free. She touched them together, and a spark jumped between them. Small but warm. She did it again, creating tiny bursts of heat near her hands. It was barely anything. It would not save her by itself, but it slowed the cold's advance. She looked up at the viewing screen, directly at the shapes she knew were watching her. Then, very deliberately, she winked. Pell made a sound that might have been a laugh. Orvin stared at the human in silence, his 4 hands gripping the edge of his console. "She is mocking us," he said. "No, I think she is showing us something. I think she wants us to understand." Understand what? Pell watched the human create another tiny spark, watched her breathe through a device made of garbage and determination, watched her survive what should have been unsurvivable. That she will not stop, no matter what we do. Somewhere between the 5th and 6th hour, Nira started talking. Not to herself exactly, but toward the viewing screen where she knew her captors were watching. Her voice was rough from the thin air and the cold, but her words came out steady and clear. She spoke about the mining colony where she used to work, about the accidents she had responded to and the people she had saved, about the ones she could not save. There was a tunnel collapse in Sector 7, she said, adjusting her breather between sentences. 3 workers trapped under rubble. Everyone said it was impossible to reach them. The tunnel was unstable. More sections could fall any minute. She paused to create another small spark with her wires, warming her stiff fingers. I went in anyway. Found them in a pocket about 30 meters deep. One had a broken leg. One had a head wound. The third was unconscious. Behind the viewing screen, Pell listened intently. Orvin pretended to focus on his data, but his head was tilted slightly toward the speaker. Took me 4 hours to get them out, Nira continued. Had to brace the tunnel as I went. Had to improvise stretchers from equipment I found in the rubble. When we finally reached the surface, the medics said all 3 would have died if I had waited for the official rescue team. She looked directly at the screen. Do you know what I learned that day? That the people who tell you something is impossible are usually the ones who have never tried. Orvin made a dismissive sound and entered a new command into the console. The floor of the chamber began to vibrate. Then the gravity shifted. Nira felt herself pressed harder against the ground as the artificial gravity increased beyond Earth normal. Her body grew heavy. Each breath became work. The insulating material she had wrapped around herself seemed to gain weight. Moving was like swimming through thick mud. She adapted. Instead of sitting upright, she lay flat on her back. It spread the pressure across her whole body rather than concentrating it on her spine. She adjusted her breather to lie against her face without needing to hold it. She moved her legs in small circles to keep the blood flowing. 1.5 times Earth gravity, Orvin announced. Still breathing. Still conscious. Earth has heavy gravity compared to most inhabited worlds, Pell noted. Humans evolved to carry their own weight constantly. They're stronger than they appear. Then we will test the limits of that strength. The gravity increased again. 1.8 times Earth normal. Nira felt her ribs creak under the pressure. Breathing became a conscious effort, each inhale a small victory against the force pressing down on her chest. She kept breathing. She kept moving her legs. She kept living. After an hour at increased gravity, Orvin reduced it back to normal. Not out of mercy, but because he wanted to try something else. The chamber began to fill with a faint mist. Not gas, but tiny particles suspended in whatever thin atmosphere remained. The particles stung Nira's eyes. They made her exposed skin itch and burn. Some kind of irritant designed to cause discomfort and distraction. She tore strips from the remaining fabric and tied them around her hands and face, covering every inch of exposed skin. Her eyes watered, but she did not rub them. She knew that would only make it worse. Every test, Pell said quietly. Every single test. She found a way. Orvin's expression had changed over the hours. The clinical interest was still there, but something else had joined it. Something that looked almost like respect, though he would never admit it. She is remarkable, he said. I will note that in my report. But every species has limits. We simply have not found hers yet. Have you considered, Pell began carefully, that perhaps we should stop looking? Orvin turned to face his junior colleague. What did you say? We have gathered more data on human resilience than any study before us. We have documented abilities that will reshape our understanding of their species. Is that not enough? Enough. Orvin moved closer to Pell, his forearms crossed over his chest. Science is not about enough. Science is about complete understanding. I will not stop until I know exactly what breaks a human. In the chamber, Nira had stopped talking. She conserved her energy now, breathing slowly through her modified filter, her body wrapped in insulation and fabric strips. But she was listening. The speaker system worked both ways when they forgot to mute it. She had heard every word of their argument. She knew what Orvin wanted. He wanted to see her break. He wanted to watch her give up, surrender, accept death. He needed to find the point where human will collapse under pressure. She thought about Bess, the girl in the colony who could not breathe without medicine. She thought about Will, the boy who needed surgery. She thought about all the people waiting for the cargo she was supposed to deliver. They were counting on her. They did not know it, but they were. And that meant giving up was not an option she could choose. She looked at the viewing screen one more time. Her eyes were red from the irritant particles. Her body ached from the gravity stress. Her lungs burned from hours of breathing thin, poisoned air. But her gaze was steady. And somewhere in that gaze was a message for Orvin. You will not find what you are looking for. Not in me. Not today. 9 hours. Nira had survived 9 hours in conditions that should have killed her in minutes. Her body was exhausted beyond anything she had ever felt. Every muscle ached. Her skin was raw from the irritant particles. Her throat was dry and scratched from breathing filtered air through improvised equipment. But she was alive. And as long as she was alive, there was hope. Orvin had left the observation room to review his data in private. That meant Pell was alone at the viewing screen. The junior researcher sat motionless, all 4 of her hands folded in her lap, watching the human with an expression that Nira could not quite read from behind the transparent wall. Then Pell did something unexpected. She opened a communication channel. Human, she said. Her voice was softer than Orvin's, less certain. Can you hear me? Nira turned her head toward the screen. It was an effort. Everything was an effort now. She nodded slowly. I want to understand something. Pell paused, as if choosing her words carefully. Why do you keep fighting? You must know by now that Orvin will not stop until you break. Continuing only delays the inevitable. Why not simply accept what is coming? For a long moment, Nira did not answer. She lay on the cold floor in her cocoon of insulation and fabric, breathing through her crude device, and thought about the question. It deserved an honest answer. There is a colony, she finally said. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but the chamber's audio systems picked it up clearly. Frontier settlement. 300 people try to build a life in the middle of nowhere. I was bringing them medical supplies. You mentioned this before. The cargo. There's a girl there named Bess. She's 8 years old. Her lungs do not work right. She needs medication every day or she starts to suffocate slowly. The shipment I was carrying had 6 months of her medicine. Pell said nothing. She just listened. There's a boy named Will, 12 years old. Smart kid. Wants to be an engineer someday. He has a growth in his stomach that needs to be removed. The surgical supplies for his operation were in my cargo. Nira turned her head to look directly at the viewing screen. At Pell, if I give up, I'm giving up on them. I am deciding that my comfort, my survival, matters more than theirs. And I cannot do that. I do not know how to do that. She paused to take a slow breath through her breather. So I keep fighting, not because I think I can win, but because stopping means choosing myself over people who need me. Pell was silent for a long time. When she spoke again, her voice was strange, thick with something Nira did not expect to hear from an alien who had watched her suffer for hours. I think I understand now, Pell said. Humans do not survive because they're strong or clever, though you are both of those things. You survive because you carry others with you. Their weight gives you strength. Before Nira could respond, the door to the observation room slid open. Orvin walked in, his 4 arms carrying data tablets and equipment. He stopped when he saw Pell at the communication console. What are you doing? Gathering data, Pell said. She did not look away from the viewing screen. The human was explaining her survival instinct. Orvin made a dismissive sound. He moved to the main control panel and began entering commands. I have designed the final phase of our experiment. A concentrated nerve agent introduced directly into the chamber. No filter can stop it. No improvisation can counter it. We will finally document the complete failure of human survival mechanisms. Pell stood up from her seat. No. The word hung in the air like a physical thing. Orvin slowly turned to face her, his dark eyes narrowing. What did you say? I said no. Pell moved to stand between Orvin and the control panel. Her smaller body seemed fragile next to his tall frame, but she did not back down. We have gathered enough data. More than enough. Continuing serves no scientific purpose. It is just cruelty now. You forget yourself, Orvin said coldly. I'm a senior researcher. This is my experiment, and I am refusing to participate further. Pell's voice was shaking, but she held her ground. 2 centuries of studying species, Orvin. In all that time, have you ever once considered what they might have to teach us? This human has shown more strength and will in 9 hours than any subject we have ever observed. Does that not deserve some measure of respect? Orvin stepped closer, towering over her. Respect is for equals. Humans are not our equals. After what I have witnessed today, Pell said quietly, I'm not certain that is true. In the chamber, Nira watched the 2 aliens face each other. She could not hear their words clearly anymore, but she could see the tension in their bodies. The smaller one standing firm. The larger one growing angry. Something was about to break. She just hoped it would not be her. Pell moved faster than Orvin expected. Her 4 hands flew across the emergency controls before he could stop her. Warning lights flashed. Alarms blared. And the chamber doors unlocked as breathable atmosphere flooded back into the room where Nira Wells had spent the last 9 hours fighting to stay alive. The rush of fresh air hit Nira like a wave. She dropped her crude breather and took the deepest breath of her life. Real oxygen, clean and cool and perfect. Her lungs expanded fully for the first time in hours. Tears streamed down her face, cutting tracks through the dust and grime that covered her skin. Orvin grabbed Pell by one of her arms, pulling her away from the console. What have you done? The experiment was not complete. The experiment is over, Pell said. She twisted free of his grip with surprising strength. I have ended it, and if you try to restart it, I will report your methods to the Research Council. Unauthorized testing, excessive cruelty, failure to follow protocols for sentient subjects. Choose your next action carefully, Orvin. The 2 aliens stared at each other. For a moment, Nira thought Orvin might attack his junior colleague. His body was rigid with fury. But then something shifted in his expression. The anger did not disappear, but it retreated behind a cold mask of calculation. This is not finished, he said quietly. Then he turned and walked out of the observation room without looking back. Pell let out a breath she had been holding. Her hands were trembling. She had just destroyed her career challenged a senior researcher, and broken every rule she had followed for over a century. And she felt lighter than she had in years. She walked to the chamber door and pressed the control to open it fully. Nira was sitting up now, still wrapped in her cocoon of insulation, still surrounded by the scraps and debris of her impossible survival tools. She looked up as the alien entered the room. Pell was smaller than Nira had imagined, younger looking somehow despite the alien features. And she was scared. Nira could see it in the way she moved, the way her dark eyes darted around the chamber. "I am sorry," Pell said. The word came out stiff, unpracticed. "What we did to you is wrong. I knew it was wrong, and I did nothing until it was almost too late. That does not deserve forgiveness." Nira looked at her for a long moment. Then she slowly unwrapped herself from her protective layers and stood up on shaking legs. Her body screamed at her, every muscle protesting, but she stayed upright. "My cargo," she said. Her voice was hoarse but clear. "The medical supplies. Can they still reach the colony?" Pell blinked. Of all the things the human could have said, all the anger and accusation she had every right to deliver, she asked about her cargo, about the people waiting for her. "Yes," Pell said. "Your ship is intact. I will personally ensure it is released. I can provide navigation data that will save you nearly a full day of travel time." Nira nodded. She bent down and picked up the crude breather she had made, turning it over in her hands. A cracked pipe, flexible wiring, fabric and gel sealant. Garbage transformed into survival. "Why did you stop him?" Nira asked. Pell considered the question carefully. "Because you show me something I had forgotten. That science without compassion is just another form of cruelty. That the beings we study are not objects to be broken apart for data. They are people with their own reasons for living." She paused. "You taught me that in 9 hours. It took me 2 centuries to learn it." Nira slipped the breather into her pocket. "A souvenir. A reminder." Then she walked past Pell toward the door. She stopped at the threshold and looked back. "For what it is worth," she said, "I do not hate you. Either of you. Why not? After everything we did." Nira almost smiled. "Almost. Hate takes energy. I did not have any to spare. Every bit of me was focused on the next breath, the next problem, the next person who needed me." She shrugged. "Now I need to go. There are children waiting for medicine." Pell escorted her back to the docking bay where the drifter sat waiting. The old ship looked unchanged, its patched hull and worn engines familiar and welcoming. Nira ran her hand along its side as she walked to the airlock. "Safe travels," Pell said. Nira paused at the airlock door. "Update your files." "What do you mean?" "Your research. Your database on humans. Whatever you have written there, update it." She looked at Pell with eyes that had stared down death and refused to blink. "Make sure anyone who reads it understands what we are. What we can do when we have something to fight for." Then she was gone, the airlock sealing behind her. Minutes later, the drifter detached from the alien vessel and accelerated toward the frontier colony. Nira sat in her pilot's seat, exhausted beyond words, her hands still shaking on the controls. She hailed the colony and heard the static clear into a human voice. "Drifter, this is colony control. We were getting worried. Did you run into trouble?" Nira looked at the crude breather sitting on the console beside her. She thought about vacuum and poison and cold and pressure. She thought about a girl named Bess who could not breathe and a boy named Will who needed surgery. "Nothing I could not handle," she said. "Medical supplies incoming. Tell the clinic to prepare." She cut the channel and let herself slump back in her seat. Behind her, in the cargo bay, the supplies shifted gently with the ship's movement. Ahead, through the viewport, stars burned against the black dot on the Torvashi research vessel. Pell sat alone in the observation room. She pulled up the species database and found the entry for humans. Previous researchers had written about physical statistics, biological requirements, environmental tolerances, numbers and graphs, and clinical observations. Pell deleted all of it. In its place, she wrote 3 sentences that do not underestimate. "Do not test. They carry more than themselves." She saved the entry and closed her eyes. Somewhere out there, a battered cargo ship was bringing medicine to children who needed it. And a woman who should have died a dozen times was still breathing, still flying, still refusing to give up. That Pell thought was worth remembering.